Okay, good morning. Ready to get underway? Apologize in advance for my voice, but I promise it sounds a lot better today than it has the last couple of days. So we're in Acts 25 this morning, and just a lot of information today, a little application, and we'll try to dive into some of those opportunities, but just kind of storytelling as we go through Acts 25 and a little bit into Acts 26 this morning. So there's a chance too we may get done a little early. Depends on discussion. Kind of just see how it goes. And we're getting close to the end of Acts. If you count our time in Luke, we've been over a year in these studies from Luke into Acts, and it's been hopefully a productive for you. It's definitely been for me, and we're getting close to the end of that stretch of study there from the writings of Luke. Look back at where we were last week. We heard about a Jewish conspiracy to kill Paul. Paul's in custody in Jerusalem. Romans had taken him as a prisoner, but really almost just as much to protect him from the Jewish folks as to hold him accountable for any wrongdoing he had done to them. And the conspirators, we learned, had the support of the Jewish leadership, the religious leaders. And so a lot of connections you can make back to how they treated Jesus in opposition to what they believed and willing to take that to the ultimate level to kill Paul if they had the opportunity to do so. We learned just a little bit about Paul's family. Hadn't heard that anywhere else in the Bible. Paul's nephew heard about the plot, informed Paul and the Roman leadership. This was in play, and so Paul was able to use that opportunity to really save his life. His nephew saves his life as that conspiracy comes to light. The Roman commander then removes Paul from Jerusalem, sends him to Caesarea. Really a twofold reason for that. Obviously, he doesn't want Paul to be accountable or killed as a Roman citizen for something he's not guilty of, but so it's partly to keep him safe, but also it gets him off the hook a little bit as that he doesn't have to make this decision. He can pass that up the food chain to someone else. And in the big picture of God's plan and for Paul's life, it gets him one step closer to Rome, where Paul has been told he will go to share the gospel with the folks there. So out of Jerusalem into Caesarea. As we know, Caesarea was the political capital for the Romans of this region. And so certainly more of a Roman presence there. Felix is the governor of Judea at the time, and he brings together a trial and allows the Jewish leaders to make their case against Paul. So he hears this case from the Jewish leadership about why Paul should be put to death, why he should be accountable for these crimes. And he's accused of really three things. We met the lawyer Tertullus, and he sort of flatters Felix, tries to get on his good side, and then he appeals to him on three different things. Paul's a troublemaker, instigator of riots, and he tries here to, again, paint Christianity as a cult, not part of Judaism, which is recognized under Roman law, but instead something separate from that. And thereby being sort of accountable to the Roman law at the time, that it shouldn't be allowed to continue. And that Paul was trying to desecrate the temple, so a violation of their own laws, the Jewish laws, that he was trying to do those things. So Paul, of course, as he has done all the way through this experience he's going through, denies that these charges, at least some of them, but he's going to admit to one. He denies the charges of riot making. He said, all I was doing was going to worship. If you recall, he was doing that because the Jewish leadership at the time thought that might pacify the Jews who were stirred up against him. He went to worship. When he went there, he did not argue with anyone. He did not stir up the crowd. And he says that they cannot prove that he did any of those things, that he shouldn't be accountable of that. But he does admit that he's a follower of what he describes as the way. And Paul admits that some people do call this a sect, that it was offshoot of, that was not connected to Judaism at all. And Paul says, I know some people call it that. And again, today we're going to see Paul begin to make the case that that's not true, and has done that all the way through. That really what he follows as the way is the fulfillment of the law and the culmination of the Jewish religion. So Paul invites his accusers, can you bring any kind of useful charges against me? Paul says the only reason that I'm here in the first place is because I believe in resurrection. Division in the Sanhedrin over that, as we've covered before. So Felix declines to make a ruling in this case. He said, well, I'm going to wait till later. I'm going to wait till the commander comes up. But instead, Paul is under house arrest for 2 years here in Caesarea. During that time, Paul makes some connections with Felix, tries to share with him the good news about the way. Felix sort of rejects those accountability measures that are part of what it means to be a Christian, and he's hoping that Paul will offer him a bribe to get released, but Felix just kind of sits on his hands, and he lets Paul sit in house arrest and doesn't make a decision. And as we wrapped up chapter 24 last week, we saw a transition from Felix to Festus as the governor over Judea. So these 2 years pass, and a new Roman governor of Judea is in place. His name is Festus. And right away, we're going to see here in Acts 25 that Festus decides he's going to go to Jerusalem. He's going to visit the Jewish leaders there. And immediately, 2 years later, after 2 years, the Jewish leaders are still obsessed with Paul. They're going to make their case to Festus now that he finish what Felix started. And that's where we're going to pick up. Acts 25:1. As we start this morning. 3 days after arriving in the province, Festus went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem, where the chief priests and the Jewish leaders appeared before him and presented the charges against Paul. They requested Festus, as a favor to them, to have Paul transferred to Jerusalem, for they were preparing an ambush to kill him along the way. So the moral character of the Jewish leadership here gets revealed time and time again. They've got this backroom plot to ambush Paul and kill him. And so Festus, on just his third day in office, he's come from Rome to Judea, and he travels from Caesarea to Jerusalem to meet with these Jewish leaders. Does that give us an indication of the importance of the Jewish leaders in this region to the Roman Empire? They know that the key to keeping peace is keeping peace with the Jews. He doesn't wait at all to go and visit with them, and it doesn't seem specifically about Paul, but when he gets there, they quickly bring up Paul. This is still on the front of their mind. They quickly press Festus and say, bring him back to Jerusalem, let us try him here. It doesn't seem as though Festus knows that there's this plot to kill him, but they are trying to get this accomplished. Why do you think the Jewish leaders can't just leave Paul alone? 2 years now, he's been limited to Caesarea, so the spread of the gospel at the hands of Paul has been limited. It's been 2 years, they're still sort of chomping at the bit to kill him. Why do you think that is at the top of their list as they meet the new governor?
Well, wherever he moves, he's still a threat to the Jewish leadership in those respective areas, so they just like to put an end to it.
Just be done with him, right? They should have and could have learned a lesson from what that meant with Jesus. We'll eliminate him, and he only got more notoriety and power. Of course, the resurrection from the dead plays into that, of course. But they're trying to eliminate Paul because he's just still such a threat to their status and to the Jewish religion, and they refuse to accept the things that he has to say about the Messiah, and so they just would want him eliminated. They can't predict what kind of effect he's going to have on the region if he stays alive. So even after 2 years at the top of their list, here they are talking to the new governor about how they can get to Paul, and they want him to bring him back to Jerusalem. Festus answered, Paul is being held at Caesarea, and I myself am going there soon. Let some of your leaders come with me, and if the man has done anything wrong, they can press charges against him there. So Festus, maybe he is wise to what they have in mind, and he offers this compromise. So, why would he care in particular whether Paul came back to Jerusalem or not? But he suggests that he's headed back to Caesarea. Why don't you guys come with me? Bring some leaders back to Caesarea. Let's try Paul there. So some progress for both Paul and the Jewish leaders here, in that the trial will resume. After 2 years, house arrest, Festus seems to be maybe more just than Felix was, more willing to take on this difficult circumstance. And he says, you come back with me, we'll restart the trial. So after spending 8 or 10 days with them, Festus went down to Caesarea. The next day, he convened the court and ordered that Paul be brought before him. When Paul came in, the Jews had come down from Jerusalem and stood around him, and they brought many serious charges against him, but they could not prove them. So 8 to 10 days in Jerusalem that Festus is there, no doubt meeting with not just the Jewish leadership, but others. And he heads back to Caesarea, where the seat of Roman government is, and he's going to resume Paul's trial. And the Jews go there with him, and they press their charges again and again. In verse 7, we're told they can't prove those charges. And so just as futile as the first time around is this next trial of Paul. And so 25:8. Then Paul made his defense. I have done nothing wrong against the Jewish law or against the temple or against Caesar. So 2 years he's had to prepare for this opportunity. And he still is echoing the same defense as he had the first time. I haven't broken the law. I haven't broken Jewish law. I haven't broken Roman law. He's not denying all the specifics of these charges against him, but he is saying that the things that he has done, of which he's accused, it's not illegal. He's not guilty of breaking laws against either of these groups. And that's how he starts off his defense here before Festus. 25:9. I think that's the wrong verse. Ignore that. Didn't get changed out. 25:9 in your Bibles. Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before me there on these charges? So Festus here in 25:9 asks sort of oddly, will you go to Jerusalem to face these trials or face these charges, have trial there? Why would Festus ask that? Well, Luke tells us here that he might have been maybe trying to show the Jewish leaders he'd at least attempt to get Paul back to Jerusalem, that he's not going to outright send him there on his own decision making, but if Paul would choose to go there, it wouldn't be anything that would be against what Festus might want. And so he asks him if he's willing to do that. Paul here is going to answer in 10 through 12. Paul answered, I am now standing before Caesar's court, where I ought to be tried. I have not done any wrong to the Jews, as you yourself know very well. If, however, I am guilty of doing anything deserving death, I do not refuse to die. But if the charges brought against me by these Jews are not true, no one has the right to hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar. In verse 12, after Festus had conferred with his council, he declared, you have appealed to Caesar. To Caesar you will go. Okay, so Paul declines this opportunity to go back to Jerusalem. Only peril awaits him there. He no doubt knows that. He will not get a fair trial if he goes back to Jerusalem. And probably in his own mind, he knows, I might not even make it there alive. So he reasserts this need to be tried in Roman courts. He's a Roman citizen. Here I am where I ought to be tried. Don't send me back. I have not wronged the Jews. They have no jurisdiction over me. He ends his statement here with this direct appeal to Caesar. And this is a right that every Roman citizen has. At the end of a trial, they can appeal to the highest courts in the land. So this doesn't necessarily mean that Paul would be delivered to Rome and have an audience with Caesar himself, but what this means is that the highest courts in the Roman Empire, a Roman citizen could ask their case to be moved there on appeal and be heard in Rome at the seat of power itself. And so Paul asserts this. What do you make of that request?
I think it's a brilliant play on Paul's part. It's a game that if he can succeed in making his case before Caesar, it could ultimately lead to Christianity being recognized.
Yeah, yeah.
As a legitimate belief system. Now the Jews and Christians being on par with one another. So I think it's a brilliant game.
Great point. And actually, one I hadn't thought of is the opportunity to speak before Rome and plead his case in that way and say this is the true fulfillment of the Jewish religion, and a recognition of that religion is possible as something separate and acceptable. And so that's a good point by Sterling that that hangs in the balance. No doubt he knows that he's got to get away from the Jews to receive justice. At each and every turn, they have tried to sabotage Paul. They've tried to rig the system against him. They've tried to set up opportunities to assassinate him. If he's going to really get justice, it's going to have to be from somebody else. His own people are out to betray him. And he also knows that he's going to end up there anyway. In 23:11, God had told Paul that that is where he would go, and he would have the opportunity and the accountability to share the gospel there. So he knows that regardless of how this all plays out, he's going to end up there anyway. So why not just take a hold of the timing and go there of his own accord? He's probably for 2 years sort of been ruminating on this opportunity that he might have, and he's going to take advantage of that. We hear from Paul in Romans 1:10 just how much he wants to go there. This is something that from the beginning, as he traveled throughout Asia and through Greece and through other places around this whole region, he could see easily that Rome was the seat of power. If Christianity is to be accepted and spread at its widest level, it would be through Rome. Romans 1:10 in the letter to the Jews in Rome. I pray that now at last by God's will, the way may be open for me to come to you. He desperately wants to go there and share the gospel, knows that that's where the most effect would be. So God's told him that's where he's going to go, and he just takes the bull by the horns here and says, I appeal to Caesar. So Festus, on the other hand, he might see this as a way to get him away from the Jews. And sort of like we made reference to earlier, this may be a way for Festus to get out of having to ever make a decision in this controversial case. You don't want me to decide your fate. You need to have your case heard in Rome. That's fine with Festus, right? He's like, I'll just pass the buck on up the system here. And so he says, if that's where you want to go, then we'll see to it that that's where you go. 25:13 and 14. A few days later, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived at Caesarea to pay their respects to Festus. Since they were spending many days there, Festus discussed Paul's case with the king, and he said, there's a man here whom Felix left as a prisoner. So we meet a new character here, King Agrippa. Comes from the line of Herod. He brings with him his sister, Bernice, and it says, as Festus has taken over this role of governor of Judea, that King Agrippa, who is real similar to the other kings of the Herod line that we know, sort of is a puppet ruler. The Romans are pulling the strings, and he is the king of the Jews, sort of in name only, and working for the Romans more than for the Jewish people. His great-grandfather was Herod the Great, who was king of the Jews around the time of Jesus' birth. And he is a nephew to Herod Antipas, who was the king of the Jews during the time of Jesus' trials and death, resurrection. So Agrippa II is the son of Herod Agrippa I, who we met in Acts 12. He is the one who was eaten by worms and died a really horrible death because of some of the actions he had taken to take glory for himself rather than giving that back to God. And so Agrippa I died a terrible death. This is Agrippa the second. He was only 17 at the time of his father's passing, and he's the last known king of the Herodian dynasty. So throughout the biblical story, that we're familiar with that name, right? And all of these connections back to Herod the Great, and so he's going to be the last one we know about. Maybe historically not the last one ever, but the one from Scripture and actually from history too seems to be the last of that line. His sister is Bernice. She is married to their uncle, and she is a mistress to the emperor's son Titus. So this is a well-connected couple of folks. Not at the seat of Roman power, but certainly an influential player in politics in the region. And so they come to pay their respects to Festus, and Festus is like, hey, I got a story for you. Tell you about this guy that got left behind. You're Jewish. You may be able to weigh in on this story. So 15 through 19. When I went to Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews brought charges against him and asked that he be condemned. I told them that it is not the Roman custom to hand over anyone before they have faced their accusers and have had an opportunity to defend themselves against the charges. When they came here with me, I did not delay the case, but convened the court the next day and ordered the man to be brought in. When his accusers got up to speak, they did not charge him with any of the crimes I had expected. Instead, they had some points of dispute with him about their own religion and about a dead man named Jesus, who Paul claimed was alive. Kind of fascinating here, right, to get an insight into this story being told from a pagan point of view. This Roman official who's new to the region, new to the story, he's trying to get up to speed on what this whole controversy is about. He sat through this trial. How did Festus summarize Christianity in this 4-verse section? What stands out to you about what stood out to him? What do you think?
He just seemed kind of nonchalant.
He definitely did. What did he mention right after that, Gene, specifically? Yeah, this dead guy, right? Jesus, okay, who Paul claimed was alive. So Festus, he didn't know much about Christianity. He's new to the story. But he could sense here that is the key of the argument. The resurrection of Jesus, that is the dividing line between the Jewish leadership and that religion and this new Christianity known as the Way. That was the separation, right? The central belief between the fact that Jesus had been risen from the dead and that he was risen from the dead as the Messiah of these people. Even a pagan could see that. He's like, I could kind of narrow this down to just one thing, some points of dispute about their religion and a dead man named Jesus that Paul claims is alive. A couple questions to think about from our perspective. Do you think that non-believers sometimes misunderstand our faith? How can we make things clear to those who misunderstand the Christian faith? I thought about these questions, a couple questions this week, and thinking about how many times the Christian faith is labeled as all of the things we're not supposed to do, right? Characterized and painted into a corner as, well, Christianity is just a list of things that you ought not to do in your life. But we would say that Christianity, much like what Festus says, is about the resurrection of Jesus and the deliverance from sin, that we would have a relationship with God, and the things that we don't include in our life as part of our practices, they're in deference to Jesus, to what he has said we ought to do. And so we could stress that idea that we are sinners just like they are, and that Jesus came and suffered for us, died on the cross, raised from the dead, so that we could be forgiven for those sins. And it's grace that really characterizes the Christian faith, and that the obedience that we have is in sort of gratitude for what Jesus has done for us. Any thoughts?
There's a lot of people that would categorize Christianity or describe Christianity not that dissimilar from how Festus had.
Yeah, yeah.
And a lot of them would say, you base your whole life on this, guy that, if he's real, was just a good guy,
Mm-hmm.
and many people just look at it as Jesus is just someone who's just a really good guy in history, and you base your whole life on a belief in this, guy that may or may not be what you think he is. So I think there's a lot of people that say, don't have
We haven't departed too far from that. That you're hung up on this dead guy that you claim is alive, and then what that resurrection represents to us. It's a good point. Any other thoughts on that?
One thing that's always been amazing to me, talking to non-believers, I always have this little thing I ask them, I said, have you read this year's date down
Oh, yeah.
recently? Did you know that years, 2,000 years ago when Jesus was born, the whole world?
We mark the time by that, don't we? Yeah. I think too, some people would say, you're a Christian. Why does God let suffering and trials into your life? And, we sometimes wonder that ourselves. Why does that happen? When we are obedient to the things we're supposed to be obedient to, and yet we suffer just like anyone else. And our faith would tell us that we're able to make it through those times because of our faith, and those are trials and testings that we can persevere through. And so that sometimes can be hard for folks too who are outside the faith to understand those types of things. So Luke gives us this insight into this conversation back and forth between Agrippa, who would know much about the Jewish faith, and Festus, who is just learning about it and has met with Paul and is trying to struggle and grapple with the idea of what these things mean. 20 and 21, I was at a loss how to investigate such matters. So I asked if he'd be willing to go to Jerusalem and stand trial there on these charges. But when Paul made his appeal to be held over for the emperor's decision, I ordered him held until I could send him to Caesar. So Festus here is just sitting, sort of discussing this case with Agrippa. He thinks that maybe Agrippa might have some insight that help him. Why was Paul even brought here? Why couldn't the Jews have just handled this in the first place? What do you think about Festus and his character as the story moves forward? Seems to be an opportunistic guy, doesn't he? We're sort of led to believe that the Jews intended to kill Paul on his way back to Jerusalem, and maybe Festus knew about that, maybe he didn't. He refused to bring Paul back there, and then he gets back and is like, well, maybe I could make this happen, but it would be Paul's choice, not mine. And so he asked Paul if he's willing to do that, and then here he characterizes it as giving an opportunity to Paul that might be of his benefit. He kind of just seems to sort of play to the crowd that he's around, to me, like a politician of all time, right? Like I'm going to try to get along with whoever I'm talking to at the time. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Keep everybody happy. Yeah.
He'd like to move this case out into the jurisdiction as easily as possible, whether that just set Paul free or, he really wants to be transferred, whatever,
Yeah, let it be his decision, not mine. And I think that seems to characterize Sterling, to your point, that they just try to keep from having to make any decision all the way through their reigns. And every governor that pops up, it's like, let's just see who we can get to solve this for us. And not. Yeah. And they have a legitimate out in that Paul is a Roman citizen and he has this right to make this choice. And so they're going to do that and let him make that. So how are the pagan Romans handling Paul versus how the religious Jews are? Well, I think the Romans are doing everything they can to protect his rights as a citizen of their empire, and the religious Jews are trying to kill him at any chance that they get. And they're fearful of where his message might take the Jews of the region, and the Romans are fearful in a different way, but they continue to do right by Paul and try to give him the rights that other citizens are entitled. And so there's a contrast between the pagan Romans and the religious Jews and how they're trying to resolve the Paul situation. 25:22. Then Agrippa said to Festus, "I'd like to hear this man myself." And he replied, "Tomorrow you will hear him." So Agrippa seems interested. He's heard the story from Festus. He's like, I wouldn't mind to hear this guy. I would be surprised if Agrippa had never heard of Paul. Maybe this is his first opportunity to hear from him. But Festus invites Agrippa to come in, and he'll bring Paul before him, and Agrippa can hear for himself the things that Paul has to say, and maybe they can reconnect about what they think after the situation. So 23-27. The next day, Agrippa and Bernice came with great pomp and entered the audience room with the high-ranking military officers and the prominent men of the city. At the command of Festus, Paul was brought in. Festus said, "King Agrippa, and all who are present with us, you see this man. The whole Jewish community has petitioned me about him in Jerusalem and here in Caesarea, shouting that he ought not to live any longer. I found that he had done nothing deserving of death, but because he made his appeal to the emperor, I decided to send him to Rome. But I have nothing definite to write His Majesty about him. Therefore, I have brought him before all of you, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that as a result of this investigation, I may have something to write. For I think it is unreasonable to send a prisoner on to Rome without specifying the charges against him." So Festus, politically expedient. Let's see if I can get you to tell me what you think Paul has done wrong. Agrippa and Bernice, they come for this trial. Festus introduces Paul. He announces these plans that he has to send Paul to Rome because of his request. But he doesn't even really know what to tell the Roman government that Paul has done wrong. He clearly doesn't have a complete grasp on the Jewish religion, and really, why would he? He's new to the scene, but he doesn't know what to write in regards to the charges, so he's asking for Agrippa's help. Can I involve you in this situation to help me define what it is I should tell the Roman government that Paul is guilty of? So Festus has struggled to find any kind of law violation that he could categorize for them, and so he's going to ask King Agrippa, who is Jewish, maybe you can help me figure out what's going on. So we move on to Acts 26, 1-3. Then Agrippa said to Paul, "You have permission to speak for yourself." So Paul motioned with his hand and began his defense. "King Agrippa, I consider myself fortunate to stand before you today as I make my defense against all the accusations of the Jews, and especially so because you are well acquainted with all the Jewish customs and controversies. Therefore, I beg you to listen to me patiently." So Agrippa invites Paul to speak for himself, and we get another insight here from Luke as to just the wisdom of Paul, the skill and talent that he has as a speaker. Regardless of the audience, he seems to know exactly what to say, and we get this almost like Matlock, right? He's waving his hand to get underway. He's got this air about him, and he starts his rhetoric here by acknowledging that Agrippa would be familiar with Jewish customs and controversies. So he finds common ground, as he has all along. I'm familiar with Jewish religion, and so are you, Agrippa. And so you'd be familiar with the charges against me, and I can help you understand why those charges are untrue. And so we're just alike, you and I, and you'll be able to read between the lines here as to what the Jewish leadership is trying to do. 4-8, the Jewish people all know the way I have lived ever since I was a child, from the beginning of my life in my own country and also in Jerusalem. They have known me for a long time and can testify, if they are willing, that I conform to the strictest sect of our religion, living as a Pharisee. And now it is because of my hope in what God has promised our ancestors that I'm on trial today. This is the promise of our 12 tribes. This is the promise of our 12 tribes are hoping to see fulfilled as they earnestly serve God day and night. King Agrippa, it is because of this hope that the Jews are accusing me. Why should any of you consider it incredible that God raises the dead? So one more time we hear from Paul these Jewish credentials, and he's had to share these before synagogue after synagogue, controversial speech after controversial speech. When he speaks to those who are connected to Judaism, he makes a defense, and he's like, I was the worst of these people. I was just like you. Hated the Christian religion, hated what Jesus had to stand for. So as he begins his defense here in 1 through 11, these connections that he makes between Christian faith and Jewish religion, he's saying here, in as much in 4 through 8, that this is just a natural fulfillment of what we've tried to follow all along. That the prophecy about the Messiah and all the things the Messiah would be is fulfilled in Jesus. And he's making that connection here, especially in 6 through 8. Paul did not change gods. Paul did not change religions. He still worships the Jewish God, and he's still a Jew himself, following many of the customs. But he sees this fulfillment in Jesus. So N.T. Wright had a couple of quotes about this speech that Paul makes. Paul would have said that he followed the one true God down the line. He had always promised to lead his people, the line that would lead to resurrection. So he's said again and again that the big problem here is the idea of Jesus being risen from the dead and what that meant for their relationship with God. Paul's not saying Jews worship like this, but I'm saying something different. Rather, the message I believe and preach is rooted in the worshiping life of Israel itself. So Agrippa would be familiar, and Paul would say, hey, I haven't departed this religion. The religion has sort of departed Paul. It's like, I believe this to be the fulfillment of everything we were waiting for, and we've missed the boat as Jews, and so this is my case here, 9 through 11. I too was convinced that I ought to do all that was possible to oppose the name of Jesus of Nazareth. And that is just what I did in Jerusalem. On the authority of the chief priests, I put many of the Lord's people in prison. And when they were put to death, I cast my vote against them. Many a time I went from one synagogue to another to have them punished, and I tried to force them to blaspheme. I was so obsessed with persecuting them that I even hunted them down in foreign cities. So don't know everything that Agrippa knows about Paul, but he reminds him, in case he's unaware, I persecuted Christians as vigilantly as anyone, with the vigilance of tracking them down, not just in Jerusalem, but throughout the region, into foreign cities. That is really a backbone of Paul's testimony when it comes to the Jews, that he was just like them, and that something had changed his spirit, changed his mind, changed his heart, changed the direction of his life. And that's the stage that we'll head to next week. This speech and this historical perspective that Paul's given to Agrippa here sets the stage for one more telling of the Damascus Road experience. He's gonna share that story as we head into next week with this crowd that is kind of sitting on the edge of their seats, it seems. And for the third and final time in Acts, we're going to hear from Paul as he tells that story one more time to Agrippa and everyone else who has gathered together, and talk about the reason why he had changed his mind and gone away from this persecution to missionary around that idea. So any other thoughts on that? We're going to close 5 minutes early, unless anyone's objecting to that. We could talk about football if you want. Well, if you would, join me in prayer and we'll be dismissed. God, just so grateful this morning again for the opportunity to study your word, opportunity to be together and worship. Pray that you would give us the strength and ability to share our faith with others, even under great pressure, that we would be able to articulate what you mean in our lives, and what you sending your son to die on the cross means for our faith. God, we know there are times to act. We know there are times to be patient. We see those things at work in Paul's life as we've studied these stories, and help us discern the difference between times of patience and times of action, that we would be able to follow your will in our lives. Ask your blessing upon the rest of our time together this morning in our worship, and ask all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.